Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, Check Your Threaders! How are you doing? I'm doing okay, and I hope that you are also. I've accepted the colder temperature now, and I've remembered some of my layering strategies for colder weather, so I'm dealing with autumn better than I was last week. I hope you found some time to do some making since the last episode. I've managed to squeeze quite a bit of sewing in, actually. So I whipped up the Apollon sweatshirt for my husband that I mentioned last week. He started wearing it immediately, which is a win, and then he immediately got some food down him whilst wearing it, but there you go. I then tried to make my daughter some much-needed jogging bottoms for her PE classes at school, but they turned out to be a fail. I used the mini Hudson pants patterned by True Bias, but I used a bit of Ponte that I found in my stash that turned out not to be stretchy enough. Occasionally, I think I get so committed to using fabric from my stash for a project that I kind of bypass my better judgment regarding its suitability, and I think that that's what's happened here. Ah well, I'm offering that one up to the gods of sewing in the hope that they bless my forthcoming projects. I actually had a thrifted pair of joggers for her that I found in a charity shop a few months ago. I thought they were going to be too big for her, but actually they fit her fine already, so she's wearing those now instead. During the last week, I also made a hat from leftover fabric that I can't wait to share with you in a few weeks' time. That's going to be the project for my next Free Pattern Friday post on my Sozo What Do You Know blog at the start of December. And my daughter was not the only one needing new joggers for PE. My son could also do with another pair. So I've traced out the next size up of my favourite joggers pattern for him, which comes from an old edition of a Topra Design magazine. And I've cut it out of some organic cotton sweatshirt fleece that I had left over from a previous sweatshirt that I made for his dad. And now I've started to sew them together as well, for you. A number of you have commented that you've been super inspired to try sewing garments by hand after listening to last week's podcast episode with Louisa Owen Sonstroem. So I actually stitched the lining of my hat in by hand and I really enjoyed it. The kitten was being particularly annoying one evening and not letting me get on with the joggers project. So I took my hand sewing and shut myself in my bedroom and listened to a podcast, and it was very pleasurable. So how have your sustainability goals been going? Have you been keeping up with the coverage from COP26? I must admit that I've been kind of squinting when looking at anything to do with the climate conference because it just seems so terrifying, you know? As predicted, way too little is being pledged and promised and hashed out by the participants. And we're really up against the wire with making the changes required to prevent a really catastrophic rise in global temperatures. I'm really struggling to stay positive about it, so I guess I'm burying my head in the sand a little. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one. So sustainability-wise, I've been refocusing on things that I can change, like preventing food waste at home. So the organic fruit and veg box we've been getting was just a little too overwhelming. So I've swapped our order to the small size rather than the medium, which feels more manageable. I've also been doing a bit better recently at creating meals with leftovers that my husband can take to work for his lunch, which means he's been doing better and not going to the local shop and buying some rubbish wrapped in loads of unrecyclable plastic. So I'm just going to keep going with that, keep focusing on using up all the veg and hopefully not throwing any food away at all because it's gone off. I also had a bit of a score this week at my local hardware shop. They were selling off heaps of seed packets for half price, and I managed to pick up seeds for almost every type of veg and herb that I want to grow next year. Right, so this week there's two lovely new patrons of the podcast. Massive thanks to Max and Judith for signing up. I really appreciate your support and that of all the other Check Your Thread patrons. I'm absolutely committed to keeping this podcast free from advertising. I want to be able to talk positively about products and businesses only when I feel it's entirely deserved and not have that compromised in any way. So if you've been enjoying Check Your Thread and have found it inspiring or entertaining, then please consider supporting it via Patreon. You just need to follow the link in the episode description, in the show notes, or on the website checkyourthread.com, and it will take you to a page where you can input however much you wish to contribute. Most patrons support the podcast to the tune of the price of a cup of coffee each month, but the amount is entirely up to you. So let's talk about what I have in store for you today. If you enjoyed last week's episode with this super thoughtful Louisa Owen Sonstroem, then you're in luck. Last week, Louisa told us how and why she embraced hand sewing clothing. This week, we talk about a different but equally fascinating topic. A project Louisa started in 2019 called Patternmaking in Public Places. So Patternmaking in Public Places, or PIPP for short, aims to democratise access to pattern making by bringing it out from behind closed doors and sharing it with the public. We're going to hear about the two very different incarnations this project has had so far. Are you interested to know what happened when she undertook live demonstrations in front of unsuspecting members of the public in parks of New York? Of course you are! Plus, we learn how she ingeniously pivoted as well as expanded the project in the wake of COVID. The second incarnation of PIPP was a series of live demonstrations that took place via Zoom last year, in which Louisa invited a series of 8 pattern makers to share skills and techniques. These were recorded and are available for you to enjoy via YouTube. Honestly, I love everything about this project and cannot wait for you to hear about it. So let's go! So let's talk about pattern cutting in public places. This is so exciting. So initially you contacted me offering to talk about hand stitching, and then I looked at your website and discovered this whole other amazing project, and it sounds incredible. So from what I understand, there's like 2 phases. There's the first incarnation that was in the public sphere, and then the second lockdown phase, which was kind of done remotely, Zoom based like everything else was last year. So I'm going to stop talking. Please tell us all about it.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So pattern making is my love. Hand sewing is too. But pattern making, I think, is something that so many people feel really intimidated by and sort of not qualified to do. You know, I think it's something that it can feel mathy, and it can feel like, well, unless you have many years of formal training, it's not for you.
Yeah. There's probably loads of people don't even know that it is a thing, you know, because it's often, obviously, because it involves equipment and you need space. And so it's not often done in the public sphere. Maybe people don't even realize that it's a process.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, explaining the project to people who do so is already a little bit of a hurdle, but explaining it to people who don't sew, they're just like, well, what's a pattern? And then I'm like, okay, let's back up. So yeah, I started pattern making in public places in summer 2019. I was living in New York at the time. And as I said earlier, I dropped my life here in my hometown, and I moved to New York to study pattern making and learn as much as I possibly could about it in school and in the industry. And that was because when I started falling in love with pattern making, I realized that at least in my state, there was basically no way to learn it.
Right.
Like in order to learn pattern making, I mentioned that my first pattern making class was not at my university. It was not even in my state. I had to drive to Boston, to Massachusetts, to take that class.
Whoa.
And then the next class I took was also a continuing education one. And that one was in Rhode Island, which is another state that is adjacent to Connecticut. So it was ridiculous. I'm not like in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And yet for the purposes of learning this particular skill, I was kind of in the middle of nowhere. Just about every single piece of clothing that anybody ever wears, there was a pattern first.
Yeah.
You know? Anyway, I thought that was just outrageous. And yet, like, off I went to New York to learn the thing that I loved. And that was great. And I was like, you know, someday I am going to take this knowledge back to the masses. Because I was in a position of so much privilege to be able to drop my life and move to New York and go to school for it and take jobs in it. Like, that should not be the only way that you can learn these things. And I still know very little. I mean, it's such a big world of skill and nobody knows it all. Okay, so now I'm going to start preaching. Like,
no, bring it.
No matter who is talking and no matter how authoritative they seem, they do not know everything about pattern making. And neither do you, and neither does anybody, and that's okay. So in the spirit of knowing that, like, we all can make our own patterns, and they may not be perfect on the first try, but nobody's pattern is perfect on the first try, I really want to impress upon people that like these skills, it's like this sort of tagline, like these skills belong in your hand. They do. Patterns, again, sort of the tagline of pattern making in public places, patterns are the shapes of our bodies and our dreams. And
I
so
love
those
that.
are yours, you know? That is what a pattern does. A pattern is a template that provides the size and shape for the pieces that you're going to cut out. Those shapes determine the clothing that you're going to sew. I mean, you can sew beautifully, but still the final effect is going to have so much to do with the pattern. So it's a very powerful thing and a very magical thing. And so basically, kind of like with my approach to hand sewing, you learn a little bit and you start using it and owning it and experimenting with it, and then you learn some more.
Yeah.
And that is just a lifelong process. But so back in 2019, I decided that it would be really, really cool to take this process, which is usually sequestered away into factories or fashion school, you know, classrooms, just kind of behind closed doors. Yeah. Even if you are a hobbyist pattern maker, you're doing it at home, you're still doing it behind closed doors. You know, it's like a private process. And so I decided, like, wouldn't it be cool to do it out in public, outdoors, in public parks in New York, and just do demonstrations of pattern making and just bewilder people
That's
a little bit.
Bold. I mean, to have the idea and then do it is so impressive. It's not like have the idea and then wake up the next day going, I don't know, that sounds a lot of work. And then you did it. That's incredible. So what did it entail?
So that first year, I think I did 2 little pilot ones where my then fiance, now husband, and I went to a couple of parks in Brooklyn where we were living. And like, I just like worked on making a pattern in a public place and he took photos. Yeah. So they weren't publicized. Like nobody was like specifically invited. Although of course I would have loved if somebody stopped and said like, what are you doing? But they didn't, but because it's New York. So people are just like, oh, that's weird. They just keep walking. But, those were kind of the testers. I learned a lot of things about pattern making outdoors during those pilots. For example, wind is like a big factor because you have these big flaps of paper. Yeah. And so, you know, like you need weight, many weights. Yeah. And then just like what surface you're writing on, like you're going to get kind of the bumpies of the concrete or whatever. Anyway, but then we did publicize them on Instagram and did one pattern making demonstration in each of the 5 boroughs of New York City. And so that was really fun. Each one was in a public park, and each one I was kind of trying out a different technique for pattern making. And I was getting pretty experimental. So like none of them was like 100% successful. Well, let's see. 2 of them I think were. Yeah. But the rest of them I was just kind of like winging it, you know? Yeah. I feel fine about that because that is like part of the fun of pattern making is that like sometimes you're just going to end up scratching your head and being like, I think I'm going to have to sleep on that one. But like, that's okay. So that was going to be one of my questions. Like, which of the sessions did you deem to be the most successful? So the one that I did in Central Park in Manhattan. Was that the shift dress? Yes. That was really fun because we had the biggest crowd, and because there's so much foot traffic in and out of the park, we had a lot of onlookers kind of like, you know, walk up and be like, what is going on? And then process it and then go on their way, which was fun. But that one, the technique that I was playing with was draping on the human body instead of on a dress form. Did you find a volunteer? Yep. I had a friend, my good friend Celia, she came and so I was draping onto her, which is definitely a different process from draping onto a dress form. Can't pin into her. For example, yeah. And you know, like bodies are like asymmetrical, and when you're only used to draping on a dress form, you're used to like this specific concept of like the contours of a body, which are not really what most of our bodies actually look like. So it was a challenge, but really, really fun. Amazing. Yeah. For those who aren't so familiar with the concept of draping, that's a way of forming those pattern shapes for yourself by sculpting the fabric directly onto a form or a person's body. The other 2 basic pattern making methods are flat pattern making, which is where you're kind of plotting points onto paper and then connecting the dots, essentially. And then a third way that you can make patterns is by taking a rub off. I'm sure are other terms that people use, but basically where you're kind of copying the outlines of a pre-existing piece of clothing.
Yeah.
But all of those are just to get you to those final shapes on paper. And you can even combine methods, and it can be a really fluid, playful process.
Amazing. So what kind of reactions were you getting from the public then?
The people who came knowing what they were getting themselves into because they found out about it on Instagram and came on purpose, I mean, it was just really fun. And they were really interested in asking a lot of questions, and I hope learning a couple of things. The people who were just innocent passersby, I mean, that was so fun because they look just extremely confused. and I think a couple of them would like ask questions, but most of them would just kind of stand in the background and kind of watch. Yeah. And you could just kind of see the gears turning.
But that's awesome. You've probably shown some people a little side that they don't see, and they'll maybe think a bit more about how clothing is produced.
Yeah, that's my hope. And I did have like a free little like zine. It was like 20 pages or something showing how to draft your own sort of like t-shirt pattern. And so I was offering those out freely for people. So I hope that some people kind of chewed on it later.
I love that so much. So then you had an indoor incarnation of your project the following year. So you had a series of live Zoom sessions, correct me if I'm wrong, and then you put those out. Is it on YouTube? And you invited a variety of professional pattern cutters to do a kind of demonstration in each of them. So that was so good. I watched a lot of the Amy Sperber one about the zero waste pattern making. That was so interesting. So that is very genius of you from taking that initial idea and then kind of broadening it and turning it into something new and something else.
Yeah, well, first of all, as you mentioned, it was 2020 and doing public things was no longer really an option, not at that time. So doing public demonstrations was out. I mean, even if I had gone to these parks, not many people would have been there. So I was trying to think of the pandemic equivalent to doing a demonstration in a public park. And I mean, there isn't really one because you're not going to get those passersby. But the closest thing I could come up with was to do a series of Zoom events. And in terms of bringing in other people, I felt like the project had the potential to be really powerful, especially if I let it get bigger than myself and my own knowledge base. Again, nobody knows everything. And I just felt like, there are so many perspectives and all of them are good ones. Everybody knows something. If I'm only sharing like the way I do things or the way I play around with things, then that's going to really limit the power that this project could have. So I started trying to think up people I knew or try to find people who had interesting and sometimes unconventional perspectives on pattern making.
How did you find the people? They're not all people that you'd already met.
Most of them are people I knew. So Amy Sperber was one of my professors at FIT.
I thought maybe she was. She had such a good way of delivering though. Yeah. And I could tell that she was electric. She'd suddenly go like, any questions?
Yeah, she's the best, man. So that was really cool having her. I had a former classmate of mine. I had a former colleague of mine. I had a friend of a current colleague of mine. Well, there were a bunch of people I reached out to, and then a couple of people it ended up working out for them to participate. But yeah, it was so cool. And just the energy of having like 8 different perspectives on it was just
amazing. So, I mean, they were all clearly very talented and as you say, unique. So what did it teach you about pattern making?
I mean, sort of just on the technical level, I've got so many new ideas about ways that you can approach making a pattern. I mean, I could go into specifics, but every single one, there was some technique that I was like, I wouldn't have thought to do it that way. Yeah. Like, that's such a great way to go about it. But yeah, just overall, my purpose was to celebrate the fact that there are infinite ways to go about this art of pattern making, but I think it even surprised me a little bit by kind of underlining how many ways. I mean, you can do it without numbers. Like you can do it if you're kind of one of those people who's intimidated by math, you can make patterns without using numbers. Yeah. You can do it.
Yeah, or draping, for example.
Or even like instead of taking a tape measure to take your body measurement, you can like take a piece of twine
Sure.
and just like pinch where that length is and translate that onto your page.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
And that's just as accurate.
Yeah.
And like Julia John, she did a pant pattern making demonstration, which was really cool. And instead of using a ruler to add seam allowance, she used, I think, her thumb.
Oh.
Like that was just her standard width of, yeah.
I love it. That's so cool. Well, I'm going to sit down and watch all of them. So I want to thank you for not only creating them, but also providing like the access to them. It's such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm going to make sure I link it all in the show notes. Also, you've created a beautiful little zine that went alongside it. So your zine was called Patternmaking in Our Own Hands. Was that something that you kind of planned initially, or did it just kind of come from creating the demonstrations?
I actually can't remember when the idea first came. It was a way of continuing to celebrate the work that these people had done for me. And also, I really enjoyed at the end of each sort of hour-long demonstration, we had kind of a question and answer section where audience members, if we want to call them that, could ask questions live. But I really enjoyed that moment of kind of getting more like reflective about things. And so the zine was a way to really like literally sit down with each of these people and say like, you know, how did you come to pattern making, and sort of what's your philosophy of it, and what's your advice for other people? And I also asked questions about, you know, like, how do you think it should be taught differently? And everybody had an answer for that, because it's taught kind of one way in school, but there are, as we keep saying, infinite ways to actually practice it. So it was fun kind of getting into that with them.
I love as well, though, not only does that zine kind of commemorate and celebrate your project, but it, as you say, it also pushes it kind of forwards and outwards as well.
Yeah, I hope that it benefits people beyond just those who watch the videos. I mean, it would be so cool if fashion schools got a hold of it and said, oh yeah, we could do this a different way.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
So what's next? I know you're taking a little bit of time out at the moment from pattern cutting in public places, because you've got, as we've mentioned, loads of things on the go. But I know that you do plan to kind of resurrect it going forward. So what are your plans? What's next?
Yeah, totally. So there's several experimental demonstrations that I had been sort of brainstorming back in 2019. I don't want to say what they are yet, but there's definitely techniques that at some point in some form I do want to share, because I just think that they're like really exciting possibilities.
Right. So it's going to be more back out there.
I don't know. So if people are listening and have thoughts about this, I would love to hear them. I loved the energy of the live events, and I loved the innocent passersby. But also, I mean, you're in the UK right now, and I'm in the US.
I'm getting quite jealous of the thought of this is going to be out there again.
Yeah, like just the power of being able to bring in people from all parts of the world who have internet access. I think that is not to be underestimated. So I don't know. I mean, these are the questions I'm playing with right now. I definitely want to continue having people beyond me filling the project, because it is just so powerful to have all of those perspectives. So we'll see. I mean, I want to be part of it because it's really fun, and I also want others to be. So we'll see what next year looks like.
So how can we learn about what's next? Where can we find you?
So for Pattern Making Places, there's a website, which is patternmakinginpublicplaces.com. There's no hyphens or anything in there, just patternmakinginpublicplaces.com. And it's also on Instagram at patternmakinginpublicplaces. Both of those are good ways to learn about what's coming next. Certainly Instagram, which is kind of dormant at the moment, but that is where you would learn first about future events.
Exciting. Cool. So are there any makers, designers, or businesses who include aspects of sustainability in their work that inspire you?
So many. I mean, there are so many people doing so many amazing things. I guess one that I would want to shout out right away is Fiber and Cloth Studio, and it's FIBR. There's not an E in there, by Alexis Bailey. So she does hand sewing kits.
Oh, cool.
And she's also doing patterns now as well and other things. But that is just like the coolest business and the coolest idea. And also, if you buy a kit from her, it's for a specific garment that you choose, but she cuts out your fabric for you in your size.
Wow.
What? Which, like, cutting pieces out of fabric is sort of my least favorite part.
But once again, that's so good for people that may have either space issues or mobility issues.
Yeah, I think the basic idea is that you can order a kit from her and then it shows up at your door, and then you could just kind of take it on your camping trip with you or wherever you're going. But yeah, it's such a beautiful way to celebrate hand sewing, and yeah, she's just super cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been so fun to talk to you. Thank you so, so much, Louisa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!